Well, my name's Stephen Lamb, and I'm 54, and what I call I was invited to participate in this project, Bridge to China, just to talk about how growing up in Northern Ireland is for a Chinese person. Um, I am in a position where I didn't grow up in China or Hong Kong. I was born here, so I have a perspective of both Chinese and sort of Irish culture. Um, what I know is all learnt from parents and relatives and family members of how it is to be Chinese and growing up. Um, Other things have been just growing up here in Northern Ireland that I've what I call basically grown up more Irish than Chinese here. So the project interests me because I want to know my heritage. I want to know um, what Chinese people coming from China, how they differ to me. So I find the project very interesting, and certain learning from other people has been very good, and how the stories that the other participants have said resonate with me from what I've been told and what I've learned, and I can sort of get a similarity, but though I haven't gone through it, with certain items that people have, I've also come across. So, and heard from my grandmother and my mum and how they grew up. So, um, so I quite like, I was happy to be in this project. Growing up here is totally different experience to how maybe Chinese have grown up in mainland China and Hong Kong. And life here, I think, is a bit slower. It is all about making a living and getting by. I think the likes of Hong Kong and China still has the same aspects, but I think it's a lot faster pace. They have a faster pace of living, and they basically just it's just different. Um, and it's not until I went back in my teens to Hong Kong did I grasp the culture and start putting them together. And that's, I do enjoy going back and learning more each time, though it's different now. I think migration and people are now coming to here more, and there's more families here that the kids have grown up. I think I'm sort of one of the sort of older generations growing up here. Whereas the young ones now, probably when they look back, they'll probably realize, probably go through the same things I've done. But as you grow up here, you lose more of your identity. I think you sort of start merging more. So you do. You sort of forget um, the Chinese language is a problem. That growing up here, you don't come in contact with as many Chinese. You are very much integrated here, and I would say the young ones growing up here are going through the same things I've gone through, and they have more contact with Irish people than they do with Chinese people, and they now mix. Relationships are now more mixed. Because there's no opportunity to be with Chinese as much. So it differs. To Hong Kong or China because they're still Chinese. They can all speak it, and here I think over another generation, the next they'll lose the basically a Chinese language. That's why so much emphasis on there being a Chinese school, because the parents want their kids to maintain a Chinese culture. So they send them to Chinese school. But if you don't use it, it's like any language. If you don't use it, you will lose it. That's just like any. If you learn French or any like German in school, you just unless you're using it, you're not. So the minute you come home and if you're not using it and you're talking to your friends in English, you forget it. So you do. So that's how growing up here differ. I find differs from Chinese from Hong Kong and China. Yeah, the objects did. I mean, what we got to pick from the objects that the museum provided. We got a chance to decide what objects to look at and do a wee bit of research. And we all collectively decided on a list. And it was maybe 8 or 9, maybe 10 objects. And you just decided. And it was nice to learn how different people interpret it and how they knew more about certain objects and how there is meanings behind how objects were made or how they were painted and things like that. So I mean, it was interesting. I mean, for me, what drew me was the likes of, I think, the bow and arrow weaponry, and then there was things like the opium pipes, swords, the weaponry, of different of Chinese culture. I ended up deciding to do a wee bit of research on the opium pipes and how it influenced the connection between Irish or UK culture and and how it connected China to it, and it was interesting, I discovered that like China used opium in the 17th century, I think it was, or maybe even before in the Qing dynasty, and they used it as a recreational and also medicinal project, like substance and to relax. Then they got to a stage and they had the richer ones, got to use it more. And from the objects I saw, I mean, I actually have photographs I must actually get. It says about they're mostly made of bamboo. That's the basic. But as it becomes more luxurious, they can be made out of the pipes could be made out of ivory or metal. Um, so it is. So what do you call it? It was interesting that way, and then it led on to trade, where opium was used to trade from Britain due to the Silk Road and the trade between the countries. That tea was very important from China. There was porcelain, you know, um, they all came from China, and there was a demand for it in Western society. So create a trade route. But what because China was so big, it didn't need a lot of things from other countries. It was self-sustaining, and the only thing that, say, Britain or the Western worlds could trade was precious metals like silver. But it got to a stage where it depleted the silver reserves for Britain, say, um, and they had to trade something, so they traded opium, and they began firstly okay, there was only so many chests going over and trading for the tea, but eventually because there wasn't enough silver, um, Britain decided, maybe to give more opium, or it's created like a trade war, and it created sometime like a first opium war, and that was whenever China knew that opium was detrimental to the population in China, that they decided to try and prohibit it and ban it, but Britain didn't like that and things like that. So, but they just kept smuggling it in and created a lot of like opium houses, and and then that's created the opium war whenever China banned it and then burnt, and destroyed the opiums that Britain was providing. So when they did that, Britain then caused stop trade, and then they started attacking. They wanted their money back and compensation and things like that. So ended up anyway that a treaty was, the Nanking Treaty was drawn up after the first Opium War, and that resulted in Hong Kong being sort of handed over to Britain. Hence, Hong Kong then controlled the colony. It was a British colony, and then it opened up ports, and that was the only way to compensate the British. Then a few years later, the same thing happened, and a second Opium War, and again, because of Britain's superior sort of war um, side, they were able to. China was no match for their. So again, China then lost more ground, like certain parts of Kowloon Peninsula, and they had to be signed in. So hence there is a direct connection between China and Britain through this opium war, and it's that's what I learned, and it was actually very very interesting to learn that we are connected, and because I used to wonder how come Hong Kong is a British colony, and that's how I know that was a big reason for Hong Kong being owned by Britain. And then obviously in 1997 it was handed over back to China and became was it one country, two states, you know. So basically that's, it's been interesting, that way I enjoyed learning about it. So it did. And the project helped to do that. So the personal object I decided to talk about was just a wee souvenir metal plaque that I got when I visited the Great Wall of China. Um, it's nothing much, but to me, I'm quite proud that I actually went to one of the one of the greatest, man-made, walls, that was made, by a country, and is still standing after, was it 3,000 years or so? It's still standing. Yes, other parts have gone, and I'm proud of actually climbing parts of it. So I mean, this is the wee plaque. It's nothing big deal, but just tells you, what year I went, and it tells you that you've actually climbed and been there. And I'm sort of, proud that I actually went. And it gives you, a picture of the Great Wall at the back, and it's something that I, you know, find interesting, that I actually, it's proof that I was actually there. It's not, to me, it's quite a lot. Um, to other people, it might be a sentimental, but to me, I actually went there in 1999. It's been a lot of years, and I'm sure it's changed a lot, but I quite enjoyed, and that was my wee object. You know, I cherish. So I do. Well, I think objects are good memory. It's like what museums thrive on, Apart from like this project where you have videos, I think something that you can touch always and see brings you back, and it gives people that haven't been there, something to actually, an object to look at and feel, and they can see the proof, that, it is important to have objects because memories can fade and people can, move on. But when you have something physical, then you always can pass it down, through the generations and go, well, look, and it sort of helps date a certain period in time, So, yeah, I do find, the object to me is important in my family, legacy that, I've been there, and it just tells anyone after me, family, that, and when they go, they may get a different object or they have a different memory or, it might be as good or, so yeah, I find it interesting. So important, very important,